Would this game scare you? What about this game? Mario! Or what about this? Today, we'll take a look at a timeline of games that have defined horror throughout history. These games have either innovated on the genre and served as a pillar for other games to replicate, or mastered what has come before, representing the best of what the genre can offer. So, let's dive into 13 games that defined horror. Stop it with the lights. Cut it out. Stop! Technically speaking, the first horror game was on 1972's Magnavox Odyssey. This was a horror game titled Haunted House, which involved putting one of these overlays over graphics like these. Chilling. But I wouldn't really call that a horror game. The advent of text-based adventure games like 1976's Colossal Cave Adventure and 1977's Zork would bring about a change with a better way to present horror. Enter Sierra Online and Mystery House. Now this game truly was revolutionary. Ken and Roberto Williams added graphics onto the text-based adventure genre, creating the first visual PC horror game in 1980. At the time, there were visuals in some PC games, and the Williams were inspired by previous text adventure games, but these ideas hadn't really been combined before. Ken Williams was able to convert drawings Roberto Williams had created to add visual scenes above the text to show players where they were. And what followed was pretty much the only true horror genre at first. Unlike action-style games, you can still create a sense of tension and horror with good writing. Take 1987's The Lurking Horror, which at the time was compared by some critics to have strong enough writing to resemble Stephen King or H.P. Lovecraft. While Mystery House isn't remembered too well today, it does have a historical legacy in that it combined a visual aid with a text-based story to create a spooky atmosphere. It was something other early horror games could use as a template, especially with the limited technology of the time. Next, we fast forward to 1989. This game's pretty interesting to me, because as much as I grew up on video games and centered my life around them, I didn't know about it until researching for this list, and that game is Sweet Home. I hope you'll forgive me, because as it turns out, I probably didn't know about Sweet Home because it actually never released outside of Japan. Sweet Home was based on a film of the same name, and no, not the modern-day manhwa and subsequent show. In it, you play as 5 documentary filmmakers who are trapped in a spooky, haunted mansion by a ghost and forced to try and get out. The characters could perma-die, affecting the ending. You'd have to solve puzzles using items you found around the mansion to escape, and you had a limited inventory. If any of this sounds at all familiar, it's because the game's director, Tokuro Fujiwara, would later go on to produce a far more well-known game which used Sweet Home as its basis and inspiration, Resident Evil. Also, those door loading screens from Resident Evil, yeah, that was also in Sweet Home. While most people think of Resident Evil when they think of classic 3D survival horror, really the game's roots were a combination of Sweet Home and another major game, Alone in the Dark. This game, first released for MS-DOS in 1992, was the first 3D survival horror game. Now, this might come as a shock at this point, but the game takes place in a creepy mansion. I'm starting a list for how many games I mentioned take place in a creepy mansion. So far we have 3. Alone in the Dark wasn't just horror in 3D, but featured many mainstays of survival horror. You couldn't kill every enemy, could choose to avoid them, and had a limited inventory with the game focused on puzzle solving. While the game's monsters admittedly weren't all that scary, the main female protagonist you could choose to play as looked like this. Also, Uwe Boll optioned and made an Alone in the Dark film, and if that isn't horrifying, I don't know what is.
My mommy says that there's nothing to be afraid of in the dark.
Your mother's wrong, kid. Being afraid of the dark is what keeps most of us alive.
Really though, Alone in the Dark's usage of a creepy mansion to explore with unexpected terrors and an underpowered protagonist would serve as a basis for many horror games to come. After all, part of what makes scary games, well, scary, is the fear that you aren't powerful enough to deal with the spooky situation in front of you and very well might die. Seventh Guest. It's the Seventh Guest, another creepy mansion game. But this one was absolutely f***ing terrifying. Fun fact about me, ghosts are one of the few things that actually scare me. And a game that takes place in a mansion with FMV ghosts everywhere? No, thank you. Which is one of the things that made the Seventh Guest stand out so much. The Seventh Guest utilized pre-rendered 3D graphics and live-action full-motion video, or FMV, to make its mansion look far creepier and more realistic than any game before it. Unlike the previous games, the Seventh Guest was also first-person. Similar to the previous games, the game involved the player solving various puzzles. While the puzzles were oftentimes completely unrelated to the overarching story, and some were insane, don't even get me started on the cans puzzle. It did set forth the precedent of first-person puzzle horror games, and just oozed in creepy atmosphere. While Myst tends to get the nod for this sort of technology, Seventh Guest actually released earlier in 1993 than Myst. This became the norm for many horror games in the early to mid-90s. Games like Phantasmagoria, D, or the game that personally gave me horrible nightmares, Shivers. So, the next game takes place in a creepy mansion. Can you guess it, based on the previous games?
Resident Evil.
It is impossible to talk about horror games without mentioning Resident Evil. This is one of the most influential horror games of all time, and while it took elements from Alone in the Dark and Sweet Home, which it was originally going to be a remake of, Resident Evil came to define what a survival horror was and was spearheaded by Shinji Mikami. Capcom also coined the term survival horror to promote Resident Evil, which is still the term we use for this genre. Fun story about Shinji Mikami. In an interview with Tokuro Fujiwara, who had pitched the project as a 3D remake of Sweet Home, he states that he partially chose to put Shinji Mikami in charge because Mikami hated being scared and was reluctant. Therefore, Mikami would know what was scary. Like, I don't know, maybe dogs jumping out of a window to kill you in your room you previously explored and thought was safe? Just a thought I had. I don't know why. Resident Evil focused on zombies and utilized tight quarters and limited ammo to heighten the sense of terror and dread at what could otherwise be a slow-moving, less intense enemy. Add to this that your character had to stop moving in order to shoot enemies, and you couldn't properly aim. As I talked about previously, by making your character less powerful, you're able to ramp up a sense of fear. By doing these steps, it was far more challenging to kill zombies. You might not have enough ammo, you might try to shoot for their head and miss, therefore wasting ammo. As you were in crammed quarters, you were far less likely to be able to avoid the zombies in your path. All of this making it far more likely you wouldn't survive. And the game would surprise you with ambushes that would take you off guard, sending you into a state of panic. The game was an absolutely massive success, spawning one of the most prolific horror video game franchises to date, still going strong today. After the game was released, anything remotely resembling it was quickly labeled as an RE clone or something inspired by Resident Evil. I'm going to give you a clue. The next game doesn't take place in a mansion. While the series' backbone is similar to Resident Evil in its 3D survival horror, it became distinct thanks to its focus on psychological horror. I'm talking, of course, about Silent Hill. Or more specifically in this case, Silent Hill 2. As I mentioned, Silent Hill was unique from Resident Evil in that it focused more on the psychological. The game used sound, atmosphere, and tension to create a sense of horror while playing, along with the stories of these games tackling darker, more personal matters. The world of Silent Hill 2 is enveloped in fog, and while this was actually something done due to the technological limitations of the time, the lack of sight and awareness of what's around only helped to deepen the sense of dread and the unknown. And seriously, the soundtrack to this game is terrifying on its own, comprising of atonal music and things like drill sounds to make it as unpleasant and unnerving as possible. Mary McBonesby, do you want to explain this one? But unlike the previous games, it didn't help reinvent the horror genre, and Silent Hill 2 in particular is known for its expertise in mastering the survival horror genre in an artistic and meaningful way. Silent Hill 2 focuses on the sins and psyche of its protagonist, with the monsters of the game representing these elements like grief and guilt, with the series' most famous monster, Pyramid Head, originating from this game as a manifestation of Silent Hill 2's protagonist, James, feeling the need for punishment to atone for his sins. One game without creepy mansions. We are on a roll. Next up, Eternal Darkness. Okay, to be fair, Eternal Darkness's plot actually spans the globe, and much of the game doesn't take place in a creepy mansion, but that's the main setting of the game and you'll often return to it. The reason being, check out that segue. Pretty nice, right? The reason being, Eternal Darkness is very specifically a Lovecraftian horror and will involve you reading what's, for all intents and purposes, a Necronomicon, and has you take control of other people who have read this accursed tome. While 2002's Eternal Darkness wasn't the best-selling game, it did do something unique in dealing with how to include Lovecraftian elements, that being a sanity meter. As the character's sanity drops and they go deeper into madness over the existential dread of Eternal Darkness, various sanity effects will take place that break the fourth wall. This could be something as simple as more sound effects and creepy noises, to the game pretending to lower the volume of your TV or even pretending to delete your save, making you as a player feel like you're going insane too.
This isn't really happening!
It was a truly groundbreaking idea, and one that I wish received more attention, so I'm going to honor it here on this list. My quest to play Cyberpunk 2077 began with buying it on a physical medium. You see, I'm one of those relics of an old age. This can't be happening. What's a horror list without a good outer space themed horror? And Dead Space has embodied what good sci-fi horror is. It subverts the idea of zombie horror, where the enemy needs to be shot in the head, with players instead needing to shoot off enemies' limbs. This ratchets up the tension as limbs are a much smaller and more challenging target to hit, especially as the creatures dropped to the ground and just kept crawling at you. Dead Space perfectly utilized its spaceship, the Ishimura, to create a haunting atmosphere. The ship allowed for tight corridors, giving players a sense of claustrophobia and plenty of vents for the horrifying aliens to crawl out of. Thematically speaking, the game also deals with overzealous religious ideas and the consequences of it. Now, I want to point out, Dead Space wasn't necessarily the most influential game. If we're talking about influential, then Resident Evil 4 would get the nod, as Dead Space was directly inspired by RE4 and literally designed to be Resident Evil 4, but in space. Resident Evil 4 completely redefined how to create a survival horror with a new action-based version of this that Dead Space jacked. And as much as I love Resident Evil 4, it's overshadowed by the first game and series as a whole in terms of representing horror. But by taking the elements that made Resident Evil 4 strong, adding in tight corridors and horrific sci-fi creatures whose weaknesses were their limbs, Dead Space took what Resident Evil 4 established and made a horror game that came to represent terror in space. Take the sanity of Eternal Darkness, combine it with first-person puzzle solving of the Seventh Guest, add some modern elements, and what do you get? Amnesia: The Dark Descent. This game surprisingly doesn't take place in a creepy mansion, even though the creepy castle is sort of like one. While Eternal Darkness's sanity meter focused on witnessing monsters, Amnesia's sanity meter adds an element of fear of the dark to it. And while Eternal Darkness was a fairly easy game, the combination of first-person and Amnesia and much more intense monsters you couldn't kill absolutely skyrocketed the level of terror Amnesia could achieve. The game's reputation for fear also helped start the careers of a couple small YouTubers who you probably never heard of, whose Let's Plays of the game would help bring them to prominence: PewDiePie and Markiplier. And thanks to YouTube gamers, the legacy of Amnesia has lived on. An entire subgenre of horror based around the ideas present in Amnesia has become a mainstay in horror games created today. Games like Outlast, SOMA, and Layers of Fear all take inspiration from Amnesia. While working on a teaser for an upcoming Silent Hills, Hideo Kojima was interviewed saying that while he knows gamers can turn off a game at any point and stop playing it if it got too scary, he didn't care. He wanted to make the scariest game possible. What that resulted in was PT, a playable teaser meant to tease an upcoming Silent Hill sequel he would be working on, but was sadly cancelled. This teaser was pure nightmare fuel. And despite being short, so long as you could solve the insanely obtuse puzzles, PT has been recognized as exactly what Kojima intended, one of the most frightening experiences in gaming. It brought forth a whole new level of atmospheric horror, with a strong use of lighting to make every corner dark and every change in color dramatic. The game featured no music, but rather sound effects that would play as you walked forward, and different noises ramping up the tension. As you looped from room to room, minor things would change, meaning you would actually be on the lookout for little details, with every realization that a ghost is trapped in there with you being all the more terrifying. And speaking of that ghost, Lisa wasn't just a ghost, but an unsettling body horror version of a ghost, and unsettling to look at even when she's not popping out at you. Thanks to this, despite PT being removed from the PlayStation Store after Silent Hills was cancelled, fans have regularly called out for a Silent Hill sequel specifically helmed by Hideo Kojima. The teaser has gone on to inspire full-fledged games similar to it in style, and many were quick to point out that Resident Evil 7 was strikingly similar in style to PT. Apparently, Resident Evil 7 was already in development before PT was released, and not inspired by the game, but it just goes to show the incredible furor the teaser brought forth. After creating over 70 fairly unsuccessful games, many times creating 4 or more games in a year, Scott Cawthon struck gold when he decided to use unsettling animatronics for his jump scare game, Five Nights at Freddy's, in 2014. The game has since become an absolute phenomenon. While the jump scares stood out, it also included scraps of plot the player was fed, creating a cult-like following seeking to discover all of FNAF's secrets, and the game theorists kinda becoming a Five Nights at Freddy's channel. Five Nights has become so huge that not only does it have merchandise, but Blumhouse Productions, the film company behind Insidious, The Purge, and many other modern horror franchises, purchased the rights to create a Five Nights at Freddy's film. Imagine if you took the mystery and QTE-based gameplay of Heavy Rain, but mixed it with a dash of horror. That is exactly what 2015's Until Dawn did. It focused on making a cinematic-style game where players were asked to quickly respond to choices or actions that could result in the immediate or eventual death of the main characters the player would take control of. The idea of this design was that, unlike in horror movies where viewers can question the character's logic and choices, in a game the player is making the choices themselves. Therefore, they can empathize more with each character and care about them more when an untimely death may occur. Despite little marketing from publisher Sony, Supermassive's mystery slasher title saw a massive wave of success, in part thanks to streamers and YouTubers who latched onto it. The game was so successful that Supermassive created an ongoing horror anthology series titled The Dark Pictures Anthology with annual installments. Finally, we come to my lucky number 13, Doki Doki Literature Club, meaning 6 out of the 13 games took place in a spooky mansion. Maybe that's what modern horror games are missing. Doki Doki Literature Club presents itself as a straightforward anime dating sim / visual novel. Your character is invited to your high school's literature club, which just happens to be filled with cute anime girls of differing generic personalities who are all extremely interested in you. The game starts simple enough, with you writing poems and using these to try and romance the girls of the game. I don't want to spoil too much in case you want to play the game and haven't, but the game eventually breaks the fourth wall, with characters directly addressing you, the player, and aware they're in a video game. This leads to them deleting and moving game files on your actual computer, which you'll need to physically leave the game, locate, and move in order to progress. In a way, it breaks down barriers similar to Pony Island. These meta elements serve to create a sense of unease and horror as the characters become more aware of their existence in the player, with the player losing control over the game. It's a much different type of horror than I've previously mentioned, hence why I felt like it deserved a spot. There are other games that definitely could deserve a spot, but I'm going to mention here instead. For this list, I tried to not just take into account my personal tastes, but also how influential the games were. But I might have left out games that define the genre for you, or haunted your childhood. Maybe that's Clock Tower, Fatal Frame, or the Evil Within series. There are also games that aren't technically horror, but had moments that scared the crap out of me, like Myst with its surprisingly creepy vibes, and King's Field. I'm looking at you, Termite's Nest. And as much as I absolutely adore the Castlevania series, I left out those games because, while you could classify them as horror, action horror games like these aren't particularly scary, they're just awesome. So there you have 13 games that define horror. What do you think deserves that definition? Is it games that inspired others to follow in its path, or games that mastered its craft thanks to the games that came before it? Let me know in the comments below what you think, and if there's any horror games you think I should play. And I'll see you guys next time. Later.